My name is Meenal Tatpati, and I'm a research and policy associate with Women for Biodiversity, and I'm also a member of the CBD Women's Caucus. So we know that climate change is one of the major direct drivers of biodiversity loss, and at the same time, biodiversity and healthy ecosystems are very critical for both climate change mitigation and adaptation. So we also know that there are two separate conventions, the UNFCCC that addresses climate, and then the CBD that addresses biodiversity. And both of these, as well as their respective international science policy bodies, which includes the IPCC and the IPBES, have emphasized that neither the Paris Agreement as a standalone or the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as a standalone will be able to succeed. They cannot work in isolation with each other. They will have to be working in tandem. So within the CBD, actually, these interlinkages were acknowledged way back in 2000 at COP5. And by COP7, biodiversity and climate change had actually become a cross-cutting issue and an agenda for CBD. And since then, there have been about 12 COP decisions that have addressed biodiversity and climate change. And actually, 3 of these are explicitly have reference to women and gender. And then if you look at the KMGBF, it also has 2 specific targets on climate change and its effect on biodiversity. So Target 8 and Target 11. And Target 8 talks about minimizing climate and disaster impacts on biodiversity, and then Target 11 is talking about mainstreaming ecosystem functions that contribute to adaptation and mitigation. So we are there, and now at COP16 in Colombia, parties advanced this agenda in 2 very crucial ways. So first, they mandated the Secretariat to prepare a supplement to a voluntary guideline that is already existing. And basically, this guideline is on ecosystem-based approaches to climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And essentially, what the parties asked was to include practical tools, good practices within this supplement, and then also align it with the resolution that the United Nations Environment Assembly has had on nature-based solutions, and also to include how safeguards for biodiversity, communities, Mother Earth-centric approaches can be put into these guidelines. So that was one important agenda. And the second was that they requested submissions to get views of parties and observers and other major stakeholders on what could be the options to enhance policy coherence among all the 3 Rio Conventions. So not just the UNFCCC and the CBD, but also the UNCCD. And to ensure that if there is a possibility of a joint program of work that the 3 conventions can look at. So both these processes that were mandated at COP16, there have been consultations and workshops, and finally we now have a recommendation document that has gone to SBSTA, and SBSTA 27 will now look at the document and prepare the document for a decision for COP17. So the discussions at SBSTA 27 are very important, because whatever recommendations are going to be prepared here, they will actually shape the biodiversity and climate agenda to be implemented not just under the KMGBF, but all the other frameworks across the Rio Conventions. And it's also crucial to see whether or not these actions and this text will actually safeguard human rights, biodiversity, as well as ensure gender equality. Biodiversity loss are interconnected crises, and while they are interconnected, their impacts are not experienced equally by everyone, right? So women, girls, frontline communities are the most affected. And that is because there is systematic inequality when it comes to access to land, resources, in terms of decision-making practices over some of the solutions of these problems, right? So if you're to look at some of the data, women currently make up almost half of the world's smallholder farmers. And small holdings are actually central to food, water, and energy security. So the Food and Agricultural Organization in its 2023 report actually said that when ecosystems degrade, either through droughts or deforestation, or if there is biodiversity collapse, women are the most impacted because their workload will increase, because it is directly proportional to the access to resources. Then if you are to look at the latest IPCC assessment report, if you are to look at regions like South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, if there is a climate-related crop failure, that is going to directly impact on food security of women and women's households and women-headed households. And oftentimes, girls are the first to be pulled out of schools to help family cope with these failures. At the same time, you will also see that climate change is intensifying displacement, migration, and that in turn affects women because there is a heightened chance of violence and there is a loss of safety. So, if you're to look at all of this and you're to place indigenous women in this context, they actually have a double burden because their communities themselves are disproportionately exposed to biodiversity loss. And including that, their land and tenure rights are also insecure. So if you are to look at the CBD's own technical series, number 95, it reminds us that indigenous women actually hold a lot of critical knowledge about food, about seed diversity, about water, about forest conservation. And all of these are very key for resilience and critical responses to climate change. But we also see that this knowledge is often, it's undervalued and it's not taken on board when policy making happens. So that is why a gender responsive approach is critical. Without it, climate and biodiversity policies can actually do more harm than they can do good. So we've also seen that there are examples of so-called solutions to the climate and biodiversity crisis, including large-scale monoculture plantations or bioenergy expansion, or you could say poorly designed offsets projects. And basically what these do is they not only sometimes displace communities, but they restrict critical access to land, resources, water, and food security. So within the CBD itself, its decision 1033 also cautioned against the risks of some of these innovative solutions, including geoengineering and large-scale interventions without safeguards. So without safeguards, we will have all these risks and women will be the most affected. But when we see that women participate, the outcomes also improve. So if you have to address biodiversity loss and climate change, it has to be through a gender responsive lens, because it is not just a matter of effectiveness, it is also a matter of justice. So women, girls, and frontline communities are not only the most impacted, but they also in their own ways are leaders and innovators who could guide us through their specialized knowledge to look at biodiversity crisis or climate crisis in a more holistic way. So that is why I think it is important to understand that these are deeply connected issues, but also they affect women, girls, frontline communities, indigenous women and girls in a more you could say in a more intense way as compared to all of us. Gaps in the biodiversity and climate change agenda within the CBD. So if you look at the texts, while they have consistently recognized the interlinkage between biodiversity loss and climate change, when there is a need to now go ahead and look at what needs to be done, there is sort of a stop on committing to having the actions be more gender responsive and more rights based. So there is a dissonance and a misalignment with Section C of the KMGBF, which is clearly mandating gender equality. It is mandating human rights. It is mandating that indigenous peoples and local communities have greater participation. And that gap is very critical, because without this, then we are excluding, or we are risking the exclusion of the most affected. The second is, if you look at participation and rights, it is more like a add-on rather than a very critical and core principle of decisions, right? So it is very essential that the full, effective and equitable participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth is central to all of these decisions. The third is also finance, and the finance gaps, and most of the finance mechanism even today is slightly gender blind. So any kind of resource mobilization have to guarantee that women, youth and indigenous people and local communities can access funds which are direct, they're equitable, they're appropriate in a cultural manner, and they have very simplified modalities of use. So those are the three things. If I have to add, capacity building programs are also not designed to be gender responsive. So there is a need to have capacity building that includes women, women's organizations, youth networks, women who carry traditional knowledge, because all of these groups are very central to a locally led adaptation and mitigation and resilience measures when it comes to biodiversity and climate change. So these are the things. Specifically coming to voluntary guidelines, it is crucial that there is a stronger commitment to women's leadership. There is an engagement of women and youth when any kind of assessment is done, and that there is gender responsive indicators used in monitoring frameworks that are assessing these vulnerabilities. So these are the critical gaps that I see. Apart from this, also if you look at policy coherence across the three conventions, then you have national NDSAPs, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. You have NDCs, Nationally Determined Targets. You have national adaptation plans, but it is very rare that parties are kind of taking steps to integrate all of these together. And to have these together also, then you would need to have indicators, gender specific indicators across all of these plans. So that is another critical gap that we have consistently seen. So it needs stronger language, it needs explicit gender specific language, it needs clear safeguards, you need to have clear gender indicators, measurable indicators. So all of this, I think, are some of the gaps that are going to very critically be coming up during Panama, and that's something we should push for. We already have very clear recommendations for the policy coherence among the Rio Conventions. The Women's Caucus has already come up with our recommendations. And for these recommendations, some of these issues that we've kept in our recommendation is that the most critical issue is that there needs to be some kind of interconvention mechanism to harmonize all the gender plans of action, right? So we already have one in the CBD. The UNFCCC is actually undergoing a process to create the gender plan of action under the enhanced Lima work program. And then the UNCCD also has gender plan of action. So how do we, what are the mechanisms in which these gender plans can be harmonized? So this is crucial. The second is the very critical issue of women's land rights and women's rights to access to natural resources, food security, and also within all of this to any kind of adaptation, or being centrally involved in any kind of adaptation and mitigation measures. We've also proposed that there needs to be a task force to critically look at environmental human rights defenders, right? Particularly women defenders. We are also calling for dedicated, accessible, and gender responsive funding, which is directly supporting the leadership priorities and rights of women and girls. It also includes looking at women's contributions to food security, recognizing that they contribute to food security, and as such, that itself is part of climate resilience. And also to ensure that any kind of disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation measures are gender responsive, and that they protect women's rights. They protect women's rights to participate and access justice. In case of the voluntary guidelines, these are some of my perspectives, which all of us will be now discussing within the Women's Caucus. But it is essential that they include gender responsive safeguards and social standards. And these need to be in line with CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other international human rights frameworks. So these guidelines need to explicitly recognize that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, biodiversity loss, that they have to have access to decision-making spaces whenever there is designing and implementation of ecosystem-based approaches on nature-based solutions. They have to acknowledge and they have to recognize and value women's knowledge systems, unique knowledge systems, that they are critical to seed diversity, agroecology, water management. And the last, there needs to be a dedicated financial support to strengthen all of these actions in women-led initiatives. So looking ahead, women and girls advocates have a very critical role to play at Panama for SBSTTA-27 to shape the outcomes. So not only pushing for stronger text, more gender responsive text in the CBD, but also looking at ways in which we can build bridges between the biodiversity and climate arenas. So as we are heading towards COP17 and then now COP30, it is a great opportunity to ensure that gender equality and human rights are embedded across both these conventions as well as the UNCCD. And we have to demand accountability. We need to highlight women's solutions that are coming from the ground. We need gender responsive indicators. And we also need advocates to make sure that women and girls are included, but are not just included, but also placed centrally when it comes to the biodiversity and climate change agenda.